a quartet of colossal warriors, a single ancestral line, several conflicts that the majority of believers have never encountered in their studies. Everyone's familiar with the tale of David and Goliath, yet virtually no one grasps that this confrontation was merely the opening chapter in a warfare spanning multiple generations against an entire clan of otherworldly fighters. Scripture documents no fewer than 4 distinct giants from this overlooked heritage. Every single one towering beyond 9 feet in height. Every single one carrying armaments that would render Goliath's lance comparable to a mere splinter. However, here's the revelation that will astound you. The last of these giants didn't meet his defeat until many decades following Goliath's downfall. And the narrative of how this unfolded will transform your entire understanding of these primordial confrontations. Now, before we proceed further, pause for a moment to like this video and hit subscribe, though only if you truly appreciate the content I create here. As I always say, I would genuinely love to learn about your location. Please take a second to introduce yourself. Share with us your current location and what hour of the day it happens to be. This truly helps us experience the global community that we genuinely are. I'm grateful you've chosen to join me for today's discussion. Now, let's begin our exploration. Beyond a solitary giant, presenting the dynasty from Gath. Whenever you encounter the name Goliath, a particular vision materializes in your consciousness. An imposing warrior, bronze protective gear shimmering under the sun in the valley of Elah, a fighter standing solitary in opposition to an entire military force. Yet Goliath never stood in isolation. He was part of an ancestral line, a warrior family that inspired dread, terrorizing the territories of Canaan across many generations. The settlement of Gath produced these fighters. Historical writings characterize it as among 5 major Philistine settlements, positioned away from the shore, inland from the coastal territories. Evidence from archaeology, discovered at Tel Es-Safi, the location associated with historic Gath, shows defensive structures of remarkable proportions. The fortifications rose substantial and commanding. This was far from a typical community. Goliath originated from this location. Beyond that simple fact, he embodied the peak achievement of an ancestral heritage that extended backward through the narratives of conquest through the era when the Israelites initially observed the territory that had been promised to them. The Hebrew texts identify them as the Anakim. Subsequent writings employ a different term, the Rephaim. These weren't legendary beings from ancient mythology. They were actual individuals chronicled in historical records as combatants of remarkable stature and power. The biblical documentation maintains their existence throughout various books. Deuteronomy references their presence. Joshua records details of their lands. Samuel, alongside Chronicles, preserve accounts of their ultimate confrontations with David's military forces. Yet somewhere between children's religious education and mainstream culture, the narrative became reduced. Goliath transformed into character, a lone giant confronting a young shepherd. The remainder of his relatives vanished from collective memory. This reduction in perspective occurred incrementally. Ancient Jewish interpreters possessed knowledge of the fuller account. The Talmud makes reference to the giants from Gath. Scholars during medieval times explored their story. However, as the narrative of David versus Goliath became condensed into a straightforward parable about faith conquering arrogance, the surrounding context gradually disappeared. The remaining giants transitioned into minor details, subsequently vanishing completely from widespread awareness. The scriptural texts never lost sight of them. 2 Samuel chapter 21 maintains 4 separate chronicles of confrontations against warriors originating from Gath. Each individual is characterized with an identical Hebrew expression, offspring of the Rapha in Gath. The language is deliberate. These weren't arbitrary tall soldiers. They represented a distinct heritage, a family lineage extending back across generations. Comprehending this reality alters everything regarding the Goliath account. David didn't merely overcome an imposing adversary. He delivered a blow to the core of a dynastic menace, a warrior nobility that had threatened the entire region across centuries. His triumph at Elah marked the commencement, not the conclusion. The struggle would persist throughout his rule, drawing in his nephews alongside his most formidable warriors. 4 additional giants would be struck down before this bloodline ultimately ceased to exist. The historical context of the ancient Near East assists in clarifying why these warriors possessed such importance. Within that civilization, physical capability connected immediately to authority in politics. Monarchs and champions proved their right to rule through personal combat. The Philistines, who had relocated to Canaan's shoreline regions approximately 1,200 years before the Common Era, according to scholarly archaeological agreement, carried with them warfare customs from the Aegean territories. They placed high value on personal fighting ability. They honored warrior nobility. Gath evolved into the epicenter of this culture, celebrating giant warriors. The settlement's tactical position provided control over the Shephelah, the intermediate zone separating the coastal flatlands from the central highlands, where the Israelite communities had established themselves. Whoever controlled Gath possessed the ability to endanger both regions. The existence of these remarkable fighters rendered that danger realistic across generations. The Hebrew scriptures characterize these warriors with exacting specifics. Their armaments receive meticulous documentation. Their protective equipment gets measured and recorded. Their bodily attributes are carefully observed. This isn't the vocabulary of mythology or embellishment. It presents itself as intelligence documentation, like records from soldiers who encountered these adversaries and survived to provide descriptions. Even more significantly, the scriptures position these warriors inside a theological structure. They embody something transcending military danger. They personify resistance to the divine intention for Canaan's territory. When the Israelite reconnaissance team initially penetrated the land and delivered their report, the Anakim generated such overwhelming terror that a complete generation abandoned their faith. That catastrophe determined the course for 4 decades of desert wandering. The giants evolved into a trial. They symbolized the distance between heavenly assurance and human bravery. Joshua's generation ultimately crossed into the land, yet even then, isolated groups of Anakim persisted. The scripture explicitly identifies 3 settlements where they endured: Gath, Gaza, alongside Ashdod. All 3 became Philistine defensive positions. The warrior traditions of these giants merged with Philistine warfare customs, generating a powerful combination. Goliath arose from this fusion. He dressed in Greek-influenced protective gear. He battled using Mediterranean armaments. Yet his family tree traced backward to the inhabitants of Canaan, who existed before Israel, to the towering fighters who had nearly stopped the conquest in its entirety. When he advanced into the valley of Elah, he bore the burden of that entire history. He symbolized unresolved conflict from Joshua's period. Standing behind him were his siblings. 4 receive identification in the scriptural record. Additional ones probably existed but remained undocumented. Collectively, they comprised the final generation of a disappearing breed. The Anakim had experienced pushback, confined to limited territories within Philistine domains. These ultimate warriors represented the remainder, the survivors of centuries' worth of warfare. Their narrative intersects with David's ascension to authority. As he evolved from shepherd into monarch, as he assembled his military and founded his realm, these giants positioned themselves as barriers. They weren't accidental opponents. They constituted methodical resistance, the previous order pushing back against the emerging system. Every encounter with them signified a turning point in David's strengthening of control throughout the land. The scriptural writers grasped this importance. They organized their chronicles to reveal advancement. Initially, youthful David overcomes Goliath. Subsequently, an elderly King David almost succumbs to a different giant and requires rescue. Ultimately, David's warriors methodically remove the surviving siblings. The progression demonstrates both the movement of time and the fulfillment of a primordial mission. This encompasses more than a sequence of combat narratives. It signifies the conclusion of a historical period. The giants of Canaan, who had sparked dread since Moses' days, who had nearly prevented the entire conquest, who had persisted in their Philistine havens across generations, ultimately encountered their termination. The territory that had received a promise to Abraham could ultimately exist without these primordial opponents. The subsequent portions of this chronicle will analyze each strand of this larger picture. We'll revisit the renowned confrontation in Elah's Valley. We'll follow the giant family lines backward through the Conquest Chronicles. We'll encounter each of Goliath's siblings on an individual basis, discovering their identities, their weapons, their ultimate destinies. We'll resolve scriptural enigmas that have confused students for centuries, and we'll comprehend the reason this overlooked dynasty holds significance for the broader biblical narrative. The initial giant, Goliath from Gath, in 1 Samuel chapter 17. The son of morning had scarcely crossed the horizon when the Philistine fighter stepped forth from the encampment. 1 Samuel's 17th chapter maintains the scene with striking clarity. Saul's military had assembled in Elah's Valley, taking position on a single ridge. The Philistines held the slope across from them. Separating them extended the valley bottom, impartial territory where champions had the ability to engage. Goliath from Gath stood at 6 cubits plus a span based on the Masoretic textual tradition. That converts to something approaching 9.5 feet. Certain ancient manuscripts, incorporating the Dead Sea documents and the Septuagint, provide a reduced measurement, 4 cubits plus a span, nearer to 6 foot 9 inches. Academics continue debating which reflects the authentic original wording. What stays beyond dispute is that this warrior rose taller than those around him, sufficiently tall to warrant mention, sufficiently tall to generate fear. His protective equipment reveals much concerning Philistine warfare culture. The bronze headpiece adhered to Mediterranean patterns. His coat, constructed from mail, had a weight of 5,000 shekels of bronze, roughly 125 pounds. Bronze leg guards shielded his lower limbs. Across his shoulders, he bore a bronze spear. The lance shaft received comparison to a weaver's rod, a characteristic that would resonate through subsequent records of his family members. The iron tip of the spear alone possessed a weight of 600 shekels, somewhere around 15 pounds. This array of equipment identified him as belonging to a privileged class. Working with bronze demanded technical expertise and materials. Iron carried even greater worth during that time frame, approximately 10, 50 to 1,000 years before the Common Era, corresponding to Saul's reign period. The Philistines maintained dominance over iron manufacturing throughout the region, per 1 Samuel chapter 13. Israelite agricultural workers needed to journey to Philistine lands simply to have their implements sharpened. This exclusive control of metal craftsmanship provided the Philistines tactical superiority. Goliath's equipment carrier preceded him. This particular element carries weight. The attendance of a servant conveyed aristocratic standing. Ordinary soldiers transported their personal equipment. Champions, individuals of status and standing, maintained servants. The equipment carrier would have borne the expansive shield, the large defensive barrier that shielded the champion's complete form. This liberated Goliath to concentrate on his armaments and psychological intimidation. Across 40 days, during morning hours and evening hours, he delivered his provocation. The sequence holds significance. 2 times each day, with predictable regularity, he demanded individual combat. This wasn't spontaneous bravado. It was mental warfare, a deliberate tactic to break down the Israelite troops' morale. Each day passing without any answer strengthened Philistine supremacy. Each morning eroded Saul's standing as monarch. The provocation itself adhered to ancient Near Eastern practices for champion-based warfare. Evidence from archaeology and writings from neighboring cultures verify this tradition. When military forces arrived at impasse, when neither party desired to gamble on complete battle, champions had the ability to determine the result. The victorious side's military would assert dominance. The defeated side's force would yield. This minimized deaths while still bringing conflicts to resolution. Goliath's statements overflowed with scorn. He addressed the Israelite formations as Saul's servants, diminishing them to simple attendants of their monarch. He presented conditions: dispatch a single individual, Allow him to engage. Victor claims everything. The consequences involved enslavement. The defeated party would transform into subjects of the conquerors. For the Israelites, this danger bore additional significance. They had only recently founded their monarchy, attempting to consolidate dispersed tribes into a unified nation. Submission to the Philistines would terminate that endeavor before it genuinely commenced. Saul, alongside his military, experienced terror. The Hebrew term employed is chathath, which suggests being fractured or dismantled on an emotional level. This wasn't basic fear. It was devastating demoralization. The most skilled warriors within Saul's military, individuals who had participated in earlier campaigns, declined the provocation. Day following day, nobody advanced forward. Introducing David, Jesse's youngest son, not yet integrated into the permanent military, he came delivering provisions for his siblings. He perceived the provocation. More crucially, he perceived the insult woven into it. Goliath wasn't simply threatening the military. He was mocking the forces of the living God. That expression emerges repeatedly throughout David's reactions. For his perspective, this wasn't fundamentally a military situation. It was theological. The difference between these two warriors couldn't be more pronounced. Goliath, dressed in substantial bronze armor, David rejected Saul's gear, selecting instead his walking staff, his sling, alongside 5 polished stones from the streambed. Goliath possessed professional instruction from childhood. David possessed wilderness knowledge, protecting livestock. Goliath symbolized a primordial warrior heritage. David was an unproven shepherd. Nevertheless, David grasped something Goliath failed to understand. The Philistine fighter viewed combat as a competition of bodily strength. He depended on his stature, his armor, his weaponry. These were significant advantages in close quarters fighting. However, David possessed zero intention of engaging in close quarters fighting. The sling was a distance weapon, with the capability to propel missiles at velocities surpassing 100 miles per hour, based on contemporary ballistics examination. In capable hands, it was deadly at substantial range. Goliath's reaction to David exposes his mentality. He invoked curses upon him through his deities. He ridiculed the staff, questioning whether David considered him a canine. He vowed to provide David's body to the birds alongside wild animals. These were conventional intimidation methods, designed to shatter an opponent's courage before physical confrontation commenced. They succeeded on most opponents. David's answer transformed the entire framework. He announced he arrived in the identity of the Lord of Hosts, the God belonging to Israel's military forces, whom Goliath had challenged. He forecasted that the Philistine would collapse that very day. He expressed that the conflict belonged to God, not to human power. He declared that everyone gathered would discover that the Lord doesn't deliver through sword or spear. The physical confrontation lasted mere seconds. Goliath pushed forward. David sprinted toward him, extending his hand into his pouch for a stone. The sling rotated. The stone launched. It connected with Goliath in the forehead. In the forehead, the singular exposed area on a warrior dressed in a helmet. The giant collapsed face forward onto the earth. The mechanics clarify the result. A stone from a sling propelled by a skilled operator creates enormous force. The forehead offers a substantial target yet limited shielding. Even a glancing strike can trigger concussion. A precise hit at that speed could shatter the skull, producing instantaneous incapacitation or demise. David's stone located its target flawlessly. What transpired next confirmed the victory. David rushed ahead, seized Goliath's personal sword since he possessed none himself, and employed it to remove the giant's head. This harsh action accomplished various objectives. It guaranteed Goliath was genuinely deceased. It supplied evidence of triumph. It shattered the Philistine military's morale, who scattered and retreated when they witnessed their champion fall. The theological meaning surpasses even the military consequences. This instance proved that Israel's God intervened for his people. The intimidating giant who had immobilized Saul's forces across 40 days succumbed to a shepherd youth. The communication was transparent. Confidence in God generates triumph where human capability fails. However, this wasn't the termination of the giant danger. It was simply the most celebrated chapter. Goliath's demise eliminated one warrior from the combat field. His family persisted. His siblings, instructed in identical warrior traditions, molded by identical heritage, continued living in Gath. They would advance his legacy. They would attempt to exact revenge for his demise, and they would guarantee that David's struggle with Gath's giants persisted for decades ahead. The Chronicle in 1 Samuel depicts Goliath as a singular individual, yet ancient students grasped him as a symbol. He stood representing an entire classification of adversary, an entire chronicle of struggle. His defeat carried significance specifically because it created the pathway to confronting the broader giant challenge. Joshua had forced them backward, but hadn't removed them. Now, generations subsequently, the work would persist. The overlooked passages, the giants within the Conquest Chronicle, long before David confronted Goliath, before the Philistines held the coastal settlements, before the Israelite communities had even crossed into the Promised Territory, the giants already resided there. The Conquest Chronicles in Deuteronomy and Joshua presented them not as legendary entities, but as a geopolitical fact that influenced Israelite history. The narrative commences in Numbers chapter 13. Moses dispatched 12 reconnaissance agents to examine Canaan's land. They journeyed for 40 days, studying the land from Zin's wilderness to Rehob. Upon their return, 10 among the 12 delivered a report that altered everything. Affirmative. The territory produced milk and honey in abundance. Affirmative. The produce was plentiful. However, the inhabitants there possessed power, and the settlements were defended and extraordinarily large. Then arrived the essential detail. We observed the Nephilim present there, Anak's descendants. We appeared like insects in our personal perception, and we seemed identical to them. This analogy to insects discloses the mental effect. The scouts weren't merely recording that the residents were tall. They experienced diminishment, reduction, incapable of imagining victory. The identifier Anak surfaces here for the initial occasion in the biblical documentation. The Anakim, as his offspring became identified, occupied the hill territories. 3 particular identities receive mention: Ahiman, Sheshai, alongside Talmai. Subsequent scriptures designate their fortress as Hebron, among the most primordial settlements in Canaan. Excavations from archaeology at Tel Rumeida, ancient Hebron's location, demonstrate uninterrupted habitation reaching back to the early Bronze period, approximately 3,000 years before the Common Era. The predominant assessment from the scouts activated a faith crisis. Israel's complete assembly wept throughout that night. They voiced complaints against Moses alongside Aaron. They suggested returning to slavery in the Nile region rather than confront the Anakim. Only 2 voices disagreed. Joshua, alongside Caleb, maintained the land could be claimed, that the Lord would surrender the residents into their control. The population declined to pay attention. They threatened to execute Joshua and Caleb through stoning. During that instant, per Numbers chapter 14, the Lord's glory manifested. Divine verdict arrived. The generation that had observed the Exodus would not cross into the land. They would travel throughout the wilderness for 40 years, a single year corresponding to each day the scouts had investigated. Exclusively, Joshua and Caleb would persist to witness the promise realized. This judgment generated a generational discontinuity in Israelite chronicle. The terror of the Anakim produced 40 years of postponement. The giants transformed into more than warfare hindrances. They symbolized the examination that the initial generation didn't pass. When Moses subsequently recounted this account in Deuteronomy, he highlighted the ramifications. The giants wielded authority beyond their bodily dimensions. They wielded the authority to paralyze faith. Deuteronomy chapters 1 through 3 supplies supplementary background regarding the giant demographics. Moses characterized additional populations connected to the Anakim. The Emim resided east of the Jordan, regarded as Rephaim, similar to the Anakim. The Moabites identified them as Emim, signifying terrifying ones. The Ammonites confronted a comparable demographic identified as Zamzumim, an alternate designation for the Rephaim. These populations occupied varying lands, yet possessed mutual attributes: exceptional height, exceptional population, and exceptional power. The Hebrew designation, Rephaim, surfaces throughout various biblical books. In certain situations, it designates departed spirits or underworld shadows. In the Conquest Chronicles, it unmistakably identifies a people population, a pre-Israelite demographic of remarkable stature. Deuteronomy chapter 2 clarifies that the Moabites alongside Ammonites had previously removed certain of these demographics before the Israelites came. This characteristic anchors the chronicle in documented conquest sequences rather than otherworldly fiction. Moses additionally referenced King Og from Bashan, characterized as the final of the Rephaim. His bed, constructed from iron, measured 9 cubits in length and 4 cubits across. Whether this designates a genuine bed or potentially a burial structure stays contested among academics. What holds importance is the persistent sequence. These monarchs, alongside their populations, were remarkably tall and powerful in combat. When Joshua ultimately guided the fresh generation into Canaan, the giant challenge remained. Joshua chapter 11 documents the military action in the northern lands. Following defeating multiple Canaanite alliances, Joshua reversed direction and seized Hazor. More significantly, verse 21 declares, "During that period, Joshua proceeded and eradicated the Anakim from the highland, from Hebron, Debir, Anab, from Judah's complete highland, and from Israel's complete highland. Joshua consecrated them to elimination alongside their settlements." This appears like total triumph. The subsequent verse, nevertheless, appends an essential clarification. None among the Anakim remained in the Israelites' territory. Exclusively in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod did certain persist. 3 settlements. All 3 would evolve into Philistine defensive positions. The survivors located sanctuary in lands that would shortly accommodate the sea populations relocating from the Aegean. The Philistine coming modified the situation. These migrants, archaeologically confirmed approximately 1,200 years before the Common Era through characteristic pottery designs and cultural indicators, transported their personal warfare customs. When they held the coastal flatland and founded their pentapolis, 5 settlements, Gaza, Gath, Ashdod, Ashkelon, alongside Ekron, they absorbed certain of the surviving Anakim demographics. The combination of Philistine military structure with Anakim bodily characteristics generated the warrior nobility David would ultimately confront. Caleb's narrative supplies individual aspect to the giant chronicle. Joshua chapter 14 describes how Caleb, presently 85 years in age, requested the highland where the Anakim resided. He had examined that territory 4 decades previously. He had witnessed the giants. Contrary to his generation, he didn't experience fear toward them. Joshua granted him blessing and provided him Hebron as his possession. Joshua chapter 15 appends specifics. Caleb expelled from that location the 3 sons of Anak, Sheshai, Ahiman, alongside Talmai, Anak's descendants. These were identical identities referenced by the scouts in Numbers chapter 13. 45 years subsequently, Caleb completed what that generation had been excessively frightened to undertake. The individual who sustained faith, confronting insect-related terrors, claimed the giant fortress as his compensation. Nevertheless, even Caleb's triumph wasn't absolute. The Anakim persisted in the Philistine settlements. They reorganized. They formed marital unions. They transferred their warrior customs. By Saul and David's era, multiple generations had elapsed. The Anakim no longer represented a widespread Canaanite demographic. They had evolved into a concentrated military stratum within Philistine civilization, focused in Gath. This historical advancement clarifies why Goliath represented such a substantial danger. He symbolized incomplete matters from Joshua's conquest. The promised territory still harbored fragments of the populations who were intended to have been expelled. Their existence in Philistine land rendered them more hazardous, not less. They possessed availability to advanced weapon craftsmanship. They possessed organized military backing. They weren't dispersed communities, but integrated participants of a powerful adversary nation. The theological motif flowing through these scriptures is unmistakable. The giants symbolize hindrances to divine assurance. They examine whether God's population will trust him, regardless of intimidating situations. The initial generation witnessed giants and abandoned faith. The subsequent generation witnessed identical giants and advanced ahead. Caleb witnessed giants and requested the honor of confronting them. David witnessed giants and announced they challenged the living God. The Conquest Chronicles confirm that eliminating the giant demographics was component of the authentic intention for the territory. Their continuation in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod signified the intention stayed incomplete. Every encounter with them in subsequent books symbolizes a continuation of the conquest, a completion postponed, yet not relinquished. When David overcame Goliath, he wasn't merely securing a combat triumph. He was fulfilling a responsibility that commenced when the scouts initially observed the Anakim in Hebron's hills, the offspring of the Rephaim, examining the primordial genealogy. The biblical scriptures characterize the giants employing various identifiers: Anakim, Rephaim, Nephilim, Emim, Zamzummim. Comprehending the connection among these designations demands meticulous analysis of primordial Hebrew application and historical background. These weren't exchangeable titles, but symbolized varying facets of an intricate pre-Israelite demographic. The designation Rephaim surfaces most regularly in Deuteronomy's 2nd chapter. Moses clarifies that the Emim had resided in the zone east of the Salt Sea. They were a population exceptional and numerous and tall as the Anakim. Similar to the Anakim, they are additionally classified as Rephaim, yet the Moabites identify them as Emim. This section confirms Rephaim as the wider classification, with Anakim and Emim as particular tribal identifications. Proceeding in the identical chapter, Moses references the Zamzummim, who resided in the land that would transform into Ammonite territory, a population exceptional and numerous and tall as the Anakim. They are additionally classified as Rephaim, yet the Ammonites identify them as Zamzummim. The sequence repeats. Varying populations possessed varying identifiers for these demographics, yet they possessed mutual attributes that categorize them beneath the Rephaim identification. The Hebrew term Rephaim itself bears various meanings in biblical scriptures. In certain sections, especially in poetic writings like Job and Psalms, it designates the underworld shadows, departed souls dwelling in Sheol. In historical chronicles, it unmistakably signifies a people population. Certain academics propose the relationship. Potentially, these populations were identified for their legendary forebears, or potentially subsequent underworld connections evolved from recollections of this powerful demographic. Genesis chapter 14 supplies early mention to the Rephaim throughout the expedition of the eastern monarchs against the plain settlements. The scripture observes they overcame the Rephaim in Ashtaroth Karnaim, the Zuzim in Ham, the Emim in Shaveh Kiriathaim. This positions Rephaim demographics in the Transjordan zone throughout the patriarchal timeframe, centuries preceding the Israelite conquest. Genesis chapter 15, where God establishes covenant with Abraham, enumerates the populations holding the promised territory. Among them the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites. Alongside the Jebusites, the Rephaim surface as a single population among various pre-Israelite residents. The Valley of Rephaim receives reference in Joshua chapter 15 and 2 Samuel chapters 5 and 23. Positioned southwest of Jerusalem, this valley functioned as a passage separating the coastal flatland from the highland. The identifier proposes Rephaim demographics previously held or dominated the tactical position. Surveys from archaeology of the valley have disclosed early Bronze Age artifacts, verifying primordial habitation sequences. Joshua chapter 12 enumerates vanquished monarchs, incorporating the monarch of Ai, which is adjacent to Bethel, and additional ones. Verse 4 references Og, Bashan's monarch, among the remainder of the Rephaim who resided at Ashtaroth and at Edrei. This characterization as remainder suggests the Rephaim were presently diminishing by Joshua's period. Og symbolized continuation, not prosperity. The Anakim connection relates explicitly to this Rephaim background. Numbers chapter 13 characterizes them as Anak's descendants, who was himself descended from the Rephaim per customary understanding. The scouts who witnessed them in the highland made a supplementary analogy. We witnessed the Nephilim present there. Anak's descendants originate from the Nephilim. This introduces us to the most enigmatic designation, Nephilim. Genesis chapter 6 presents them among Scripture's most cryptic sections. The Nephilim existed on the earth during those periods, and additionally following when the sons of God entered the daughters of humanity, and they produced offspring to them. These were the powerful individuals who were from antiquity, the individuals of reputation. The etymology of Nephilim stays contested. The Hebrew foundation naphal signifies to fall, prompting certain to interpret it as fallen ones. Additional scholars propose it originates from a varying foundation, signifying giants or powerful ones. The Septuagint, the primordial Greek interpretation, presents it as gigantes, which provides us the English term giants. The relationship between the pre-flood Nephilim and the post-flood Anakim isn't explicit in the Scripture. The declaration, and additionally following in Genesis chapter 6, proposes the Nephilim somehow persisted beyond the flood, yet the mechanism isn't clarified. Jewish custom and certain primordial interpreters formulated complex theories regarding this continuation. The biblical Scripture itself stays uncertain. What appears transparent is that primordial Israelites perceived the Anakim and connected populations as linked to extremely ancient pre-conquest demographics. Whether this relationship was genealogical, traditional, or mythical, these populations bore connections with antiquity and authority. They weren't recent arrivals, but profoundly established residents with extensive chronicles in the territory. Evidence from archaeology complicates straightforward classification. Skeletal artifacts from Bronze Age Canaan demonstrate typical human stature diversity. Zero evidence exists for demographics of genuinely enormous proportions. This proposes the biblical characterizations of exceptional height should be grasped comparatively rather than literally. These were tall individuals compared to typical Israelites, not biological impossibilities. The cubit calculations provided for Goliath and Og, if accepted literally, would position them considerably outside typical human diversity. The 6 cubits and a span for Goliath equals roughly 9.5 feet. Nevertheless, the Septuagint and Dead Sea document versions provide 4 cubits and a span nearer to 6 foot 9 inches. This stays tall, yet within human capability, particularly for a warrior nobility, selected partially for dimensions. The designation Sons of Anak surfaces regularly. Anak himself is designated as Arba's son. Joshua chapter 15 declares that Hebron was previously identified as Kiriath Arba, Arba's settlement, the greatest individual among the Anakim. Whether Arba was a documented establisher or a mythical forefather stays ambiguous. The Scripture regards him as an actual individual linked to Hebron's beginnings. Deuteronomy chapter 9, where Moses examines the conquest obstacles, highlights the intimidation element. Listen, O Israel, you are crossing over the Jordan presently, to proceed to remove nations more exceptional and more powerful than yourself, settlements exceptional and defended up to the heavens, a population exceptional and tall, the sons of the Anakim, whom you recognize, and of whom you have perceived it declared. Who can withstand before the sons of Anak? The expression defended up to the heavens is unmistakably exaggerated, highlighting remarkableness rather than actual calculation. Comparably, who can withstand before the sons of Anak symbolizes rhetorical amplification, conveying the obstacle these warriors presented. The biblical writers employed intensified vocabulary to transmit the mental and military effect of confronting such adversaries. By the period David faced Goliath, the Rephaim existed exclusively in separated enclaves. The expansive demographics characterized in Deuteronomy had been removed or integrated. What persisted was a concentrated warrior stratum in Philistine Gath, advancing hereditary and traditional background from the Anakim. They were genuinely the final of their classification, ultimate symbols of demographics that previously controlled the highland and Transjordan. This genealogical background alters how we grasp Goliath and his siblings. They weren't irregularities. They were survivors, advancing a heritage that extended backward through the conquest, through the patriarchal time frame, potentially to the genuine beginning of habitation in Canaan. Their defeat would signify not simply military triumph, yet the termination of a chapter that commenced when the initial Israelites observed the promised territory and experienced trembling. A family situation, the quartet of giants from 2 Samuel chapter 21. 2 Samuel's 21st chapter harbors among Scripture's most disregarded sections. Positioned between David's subsequent reign chronicles and the poetic portions that terminate the book, 4 concise combat accounts characterize encounters with warriors from Gath. The majority of students overlook them. Those who observe frequently neglect to acknowledge their importance. These passages chronicle the methodical removal of Goliath's relatives. The section commences with background regarding a famine. 3 years of harvest catastrophe had affected the territory. David sought the Lord regarding the origin. The response involved blood responsibility from Saul's handling of the Gibeonites, an intricate circumstance demanding 7 of Saul's descendants to be surrendered for termination. This somber episode confirmed the time frame, late in David's rule, decades following his celebrated triumph in Elah's valley. Then suddenly, verse 15 transitions concentration. There was warfare again separating the Philistines and Israel, and David descended together with his attendants, and they battled against the Philistines, and David experienced weariness. This characteristic holds significance. The youthful shepherd who sprinted toward Goliath had transformed into a middle-aged monarch whose endurance was deteriorating. The individual who previously vanquished giants presently struggled in typical combat. Verse 16 presents the initial sibling, and Ishbi-Benob, among the descendants of the giants, whose lance had a weight of 300 shekels of bronze, and who was equipped with a fresh sword, considered eliminating David. The Hebrew expression, interpreted as descendants of the giants, is Yelidei Harapha, genuinely sons of the Rapha, or produced by the Rapha. This identifies a particular heritage, not a universal classification. The 300 shekels equals roughly 7.5 pounds for the spearhead, reduced than Goliath's 600 shekel tip, yet still considerable. The reference to a fresh sword proposes recent obtaining, potentially specially manufactured for the expedition. Ishbi-Benob perceived opportunity. The elderly David, isolated from his primary force, depleted from combat, displayed a susceptible target. However, Abishai, Zeruiah's son, arrived to David's assistance. He eliminated the Philistine warrior. The scripture observes this rescue stimulated David's soldiers to declare an oath. "You shall not any further proceed out with us to combat, preventing you quench Israel's lamp." The monarch's existence had transformed too precious to gamble in individual warfare. This instance signified David's conversion from warrior to ruler, from engaged fighter to shielded emblem. Verse 18 transitions to a different encounter. Following this, there was again warfare with the Philistines at Gob. Then Sibbecai the Hushathite eliminated Saph, who was among the descendants of the giants. Gob is designated as a position, though its precise location stays uncertain. Certain primordial scriptures provide Gezer alternatively, a significant settlement in the Shephelah. Either position places this combat in disputed land, separating Israelite highlands and Philistine flatlands. Saph, additionally identified as Sippai in the corresponding chronicle in 1 Chronicles chapter 20, obtains minimal characterization, contrary to Ishbi-Benob with his documented armaments or the subsequent siblings with characteristic features. Saph surfaces concisely. His defeat by Sibbecai the Hushathite holds significance fundamentally because it perpetuates the sequence. A different descendant of the giants in Gath succumbed too among David's warriors. Verse 19 presents the most celebrated textual challenge in this section. "And there was again warfare with the Philistines at Gob. And Elhanan, Jaare-Oregim's son, the Bethlehemite, eliminated Goliath, the Gittite, whose spear's shaft was similar to a weaver's rod. This seems to oppose 1 Samuel chapter 17, where David eliminated Goliath. Students have contemplated this passage for centuries. The corresponding section in 1 Chronicles chapter 20 verse 5 resolves the enigma. And there was again warfare with the Philistines, and Elhanan, Jair's son, eliminated Lahmi, Goliath, the Gittite's sibling, whose spear's shaft was similar to a weaver's rod. Lahmi is explicitly designated as Goliath's sibling. The Samuel scripture evidently experienced a scribal mistake in transmission, excluding the term sibling and corrupting Lahmi into component of the preceding identifier. This textual difference proves both the intricacy of primordial manuscript transmission and the worth of possessing corresponding chronicles. Chronicles, assembled subsequently and extracting from various sources, maintains the accurate wording. Elhanan didn't vanquish Goliath. He vanquished Goliath's sibling, a warrior who bore a comparably substantial lance. The characterization similar to a weaver's rod surfaces for both Goliath and Lahmi. This expression designates the wooden rod employed in primordial looms, characteristically substantial and weighty. The analogy proposes lance shafts of remarkable diameter with the capability of supporting the burden of expansive iron tips. It transformed into something of a family characteristic, a distinguishing attribute of this warrior family's armaments. Verse 20 presents the fourth and ultimate sibling, the most remarkable of the population. And there was again warfare at Gath, where there was an individual of exceptional proportions who possessed 6 fingers on every hand and 6 toes on every foot, 24 in quantity, and he additionally was descended from the giants. Polydactyly, the existence of supplementary digits, manifests naturally in human demographics at a frequency of roughly 1 in every 1,000 births. This hereditary characteristic surfaces in families, transferred through dominant heredity. Its existence in this warrior proposes the giant heritage sustained close family connections, potentially even engaged in intermarriage to maintain their characteristic attributes. The scripture regards the supplementary digits not as malformation, yet as distinguishing attribute, a different indicator of this family's distinctive character. Verse 21 appends behavioral specifics. And when he challenged Israel, Jonathan, Shemaiah's son, David's sibling, eliminated him. The Hebrew term interpreted as challenged is cheraph, the identical foundation employed for Goliath's defiance in 1 Samuel chapter 17. This sibling adhered to family custom, delivering provocations and insults to the Israelite forces. Potentially, he acquired these methods from Goliath himself. Potentially, the family instructed such techniques to every generation of warriors. Jonathan, designated as David's nephew rather than his sibling in certain interpretations, terminated this ultimate giant's existence. The genealogy holds significance. David vanquished the initial sibling, Goliath. David's nephew, Abishai, rescued David from the subsequent sibling, Ishbi-Benob. David's formidable warriors, Sibbecai and Elhanan, vanquished the third and fourth siblings, Saph and Lahmi. David's nephew, Jonathan, vanquished the fifth sibling, the individual with supplementary digits. The expedition against this family transformed into a multi-generational undertaking, incorporating David's extended relatives and nearest warriors. Verse 22 supplies the concluding declaration. These 4 were descended from the giants in Gath, and they succumbed by David's hand and by his attendants' hand. The quantity 4 designates explicitly to the confrontations documented in this section, not including Goliath from 1 Samuel chapter 17. Collectively, 5 warriors from this heritage encountered their termination throughout David's existence. The Hebrew structure, Yelid Harapha, Begath surfaces reliably, produced by the Rapha in Gath. This expression confirms both heritage and geography. These warriors possessed mutual ancestry traced to the Rephaim. They all originated from Gath explicitly, not from Gaza or Ashdod, where additional Anakim survivors had established themselves. Gath produced this specific family of warriors, Badin Shusufan. The strategic pattern behind these confrontations demonstrates deliberate planning. Following Goliath's fall, the Philistines kept sending out champions who belonged to his bloodline. Revenge might have motivated them. They may have been trying to reclaim their edge in psychological warfare. It's possible these fighters came forward on their own, compelled by obligations to family and the desire to preserve their honor. Regardless of what drove them, they repeatedly showed up in battles between Philistine armies and the forces loyal to David. David's approach was methodical and organized. He couldn't take on every single challenger himself. His advancing years and the demands of ruling prevented such personal involvement. So he developed a core group of exceptional fighters who had the skills to neutralize these kinds of dangers. The elite warriors under David, whose names are preserved in the 23rd chapter of 2 Samuel, included men like Sivachai and others who demonstrated their capability against giant opponents. David established a military framework that could operate effectively without requiring him to fight personally. This evolution reflects growth in his leadership abilities. The younger David had needed to establish his reputation through individual acts of bravery. Defeating Goliath was necessary to gain credibility in the eyes of his people. The seasoned King David, by contrast, needed to cultivate others who could defend the nation. His role shifted to empowering his nephews and skilled warriors to confront threats, while he focused on providing strategic guidance and direction. The destruction of the giant brothers became a collective triumph, rather than the achievement of one man standing alone. The locations mentioned in these accounts also reveal something significant. These confrontations took place at multiple sites during general warfare, including places where David became exhausted, at Gob, or Gizer, at Gath proper. The battles weren't compressed into a single military operation but occurred across multiple years. Each confrontation stands as a distinct event in the protracted conflict between territories controlled by the Philistines and those held by the Israelites. The fact that Gath served as the origin point for all 5 of these warriors underscores that particular city's distinctive nature. While neighboring Philistine cities pursued commerce, maintained diplomatic relations, and cultivated farmland, Gath preserved a culture centered on warfare, a culture with roots in its Anakim ancestry. The blending of Rephaim heritage with the military structure of the Philistines produced specialists in one-on-one combat. These were champions capable of altering the outcome of closely matched engagements. The armaments detailed across these various narratives show both similarities and differences. Several of the brothers wielded spears with shafts comparable to the beams used in weaving. Ishbi-Benob possessed a spearhead weighing 300 shekels, along with a newly forged sword. The attention given to their weaponry underscores how crucial equipment was in warfare during ancient times. These fighters weren't merely oversized and physically powerful. They were highly trained professionals who had access to superior bronze and iron implements. The fact that 4 different biblical writers or compilers deemed these encounters worthy of preservation speaks to their importance. Space in ancient manuscripts was precious and limited. Those who copied texts didn't record every skirmish or every fallen soldier. These 5 giants earned documentation because they symbolized something beyond routine military operations. They represented milestones, significant markers of advancement in fulfilling the mandate to conquer the land. From the standpoint of narrative structure, the 21st chapter of 2 Samuel brings resolution. The tale that opened with Goliath's challenge in the valley reaches its conclusion with the last brother being struck down at Gath. The line of giants that had threatened the region ever since the days of Joshua met its end while David reigned as king. The ruler who had gained fame by defeating the most renowned giant presided over the defeat of that giant's entire family line. The emotional journey holds significance as well. David's brush with death at the hands of Ishbi-Benob served as a reminder to everyone that all men are mortal. The legendary giant slayer had become vulnerable with age. This humanizing episode makes the victories achieved by his men carry deeper meaning. They weren't diminishing what David had accomplished. They were building upon it, demonstrating that his faith and bravery had inspired an entire generation of fighters capable of continuing the work he had begun. The vow taken by David's men following the incident with Ishbi-Benob shows both profound devotion and practical understanding. You shall no longer go out with us to battle, lest you quench the lamp of Israel. They understood that David's symbolic significance went beyond his physical fighting ability. The nation required him to stay alive more than it required him to engage in combat. This moment signifies a pivotal shift in Israelite military culture, moving away from reliance on tribal champions toward organized armies with leadership that needed to be protected. The giants who came from Gath represented the final link to the inhabitants who had lived in the land before the conquest. Their elimination marked the concluding phase of actually taking possession of the territory. When the final brother was killed, when Gath ceased producing champions descended from the Anakim, the conquest reached true completion. The undertaking that Joshua had initiated, which Caleb had advanced, which David had pushed forward, at last arrived at its fulfillment. The promised land had been cleared of those ancient dwellers who had once inspired such overwhelming terror that an entire generation abandoned their faith. Ishbi-Benob, the warrior seeking vengeance with his newly made sword. The confrontation where Ishbi-Benob nearly took David's life doesn't receive as much attention as it warrants. This encounter, documented in the 16th verse of 2 Samuel chapter 21, happened late during David's time as king. Based on chronology, it occurred after he had firmly established his kingdom, after his successes and his moral failures, after the incident involving Bathsheba, after the uprising led by Absalom. David was no longer a young man. The text states plainly that David went down with his men, and they engaged the Philistines in battle, and David became exhausted. That word, describing his exhaustion, translates a Hebrew term that conveys weariness and fatigue, severe enough to impact effectiveness in combat. Amid the chaos of fighting, surrounded by violence on all sides, the king's stamina gave out. This physical vulnerability created an opening. Ishbi-Benob was observing, waiting for such a moment. His name shows up just once in all of Scripture, in this single verse. The structure of the name points to Philistine origins. The element Benob might have connections to Nob, a city inhabited by priests, though this linguistic relationship remains a matter of speculation. What's important is that he came from the lineage of giants. The text identifies him as belonging to the descendants of the giants, using the precise phrase, Yeled Harafa. His spear weighed 300 shekels when measured in bronze. This equals approximately 7.5 pounds for just the spearhead portion. It was heavier than standard infantry spears, but lighter than the massive 600 shekel point that Goliath had carried. The weight indicates a weapon that balanced throwing capability with thrusting effectiveness. A warrior with the right training could launch such a spear with lethal force or employ it effectively in close quarters fighting. The reference to his newly forged sword provides fascinating detail. The Hebrew word kadash signifies something fresh, recently manufactured, not yet used. Why mention this specific detail? It's possible the newness indicated expert craftsmanship, a blade created specifically for this particular campaign. Perhaps it carried ceremonial importance, a weapon that had been blessed or consecrated for a special purpose. Or perhaps it simply meant that Ishbi-Benob had recently armed himself with the finest weapon he could obtain. Swords during this historical period held considerable value. The technology for working iron was still relatively recent in that region. The Philistines maintained control over much of the iron production. According to the 13th chapter of 1 Samuel, a newly made iron sword represented a substantial investment. It identified Ishbi-Benob as a warrior of resources, someone who could afford premium equipment, or someone whose community valued his role enough to supply him with it. The text indicates that Benob intended to kill David. The verb amar usually means to speak or say, but in this context it conveys intention or deliberate planning. This wasn't opportunistic violence born from the heat of battle. Ishbi-Benob had recognized David, knew exactly who he was, and made a conscious decision to act. Perhaps he was aware that David had killed Goliath decades before. Perhaps stories passed down through his family had influenced how he understood the Israelite king. Perhaps he viewed this as an act of retribution, an opportunity to settle accounts for the death of his kinsman. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. An exhausted David, cut off from his primary force, or at least from immediate protective support, now faced a well-equipped giant warrior brandishing a new sword and a heavy spear. The psychological dynamics completely inverted what had happened in the Valley of Elah. There, a confident young David had advanced toward an intimidating but overconfident Goliath. Here, an aging David found himself struggling to defend against a calculating enemy who had selected his moment with care. Then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, stepped in to intervene. Abishai was David's nephew, the son of his sister Zeruiah. The second chapter of 2 Samuel identifies Zeruiah as the mother of 3 sons, Abishai, Joab, and Asahel. All 3 rose to prominence as warriors in David's military. Joab ultimately became the commander of all armed forces. Asahel died while still young, killed by Abner during the civil conflict with the house of Saul. Abishai distinguished himself as one of David's most dependable warriors. This wasn't Abishai's first moment of significance. He had gone with David into Saul's encampment while the king slept, urging David to take Saul's life. David had refused but took Saul's spear and water container to demonstrate their presence. In later events, Abishai assisted David in defeating enemies. The 23rd chapter of 2 Samuel places him among the 3 mighty men, recording that he raised his spear against 300 adversaries. Abishai came to David's aid and killed the Philistine. The verb naka describes a fatal strike. The text doesn't provide details about how the combat unfolded. We don't know whether Abishai caught Ishbi-Benob by surprise, engaged him in direct combat, or worked together with other fighters. What's important is the result. The giant warrior who had come so close to ending David's life fell dead instead. The immediate reaction from David's men underscores the broader implications. Then David's men swore to him, "You shall no longer go out with us to battle, lest you quench the lamp of Israel." This oath marked a decisive turning point. The men who had fought alongside David understood that his days of personal combat had come to an end. Age and the accumulated toll of old wounds had reduced his combat effectiveness. More significantly, his symbolic importance to the nation surpassed his tactical contribution to individual battles. The metaphor of the lamp carried profound significance. In the culture of the ancient Near East, lamps symbolized life itself, continuity, and legacy. The 11th chapter of 1 Kings speaks of God preserving a lamp for David in Jerusalem. The 15th chapter of 1 Kings refers to a lamp being given to David. The imagery suggested perpetual presence, an enduring dynasty, the light that provides guidance through darkness. David's men grasped that extinguishing this lamp would harm far more than a single life. It would jeopardize national stability and divine purpose. This incident fundamentally transformed David's role in warfare. From this point onward, he provided strategic direction for battles, but no longer participated in frontline combat personally. His elite warriors assumed responsibility for confronting the enemy's most skilled fighters. David's legacy evolved from personal courage to leadership that enabled others to achieve greatness. The man who had built his identity through individual accomplishments learned to define himself through the collective success of those he led. Ishbi-Benob's defeat also communicated a message to the remaining giants of Gath. Goliath's death could have been dismissed as an aberration, a fortunate throw of a stone by an unconventional opponent. But now another warrior from their bloodline had been killed, this time by one of David's trained soldiers. A pattern was beginning to establish itself. The giant bloodline wasn't invincible after all. The warrior culture that Gath had cultivated could be overcome and defeated. The newly forged sword that Ishbi-Benob had carried proved useless in the end. His meticulous planning amounted to nothing. His window of opportunity, when David stood vulnerable and worn down, closed before he could exploit it. All his advantages in physical size, superior equipment, and tactical positioning couldn't overcome the intervention of a skilled warrior who arrived at precisely the right moment. The same divine protection that had guided David's stone against Goliath now guided Abishai's weapon against Ishbi-Benob. This encounter also sheds light on Philistine tactical thinking. They continued deploying champions from the giant lineage even after Goliath had been defeated. They hadn't given up on this particular approach to warfare. Perhaps they believed Goliath's death had been an unusual exception. Perhaps they placed their trust in the proven track record these warriors had established over time. Perhaps they lacked better alternatives for intimidating Israelite forces. Whatever reasoning guided their strategy, it was proving unsuccessful. One after another, the giants of Gath were being killed. Each defeat eroded the psychological edge this warrior class had wielded across generations. The fearsome reputation built up over centuries was beginning to crumble. The last survivors of the Anakim were proving to be mortal, like everyone else. For David, on a personal level, the incident involving Ishbi-Benob must have been a sobering experience. The giant slayer had nearly fallen victim to a giant himself. The hero of Elah had required rescuing. This experience that brought him low might have reinforced lessons from earlier in his life, that victory flows from dependence on God and community rather than from individual strength alone. The young David had placed his trust in God while standing before Goliath. The older David needed to trust God while watching others face giants on his behalf. The name Ishbi-Benob would slip from the memory of most who read Scripture. He earned only a single verse, yet his role in the larger story held crucial importance. He was the first of Goliath's brothers to challenge David's forces after the famous encounter in the valley of Elah. He came remarkably close to achieving his goal. His defeat established the template for how the remaining brothers would ultimately fall, not to David in person, but to warriors David had trained, equipped, and inspired. Saph. The second brother, Saph, receives the most economical treatment in the biblical record. The 18th verse of 2 Samuel chapter 21 devotes just one sentence to him. After this, there was again war with the Philistines at Gob. Then Sibbecai, the Hushathite, struck down Saph, who was one of the descendants of the giants. Saph's name shows up in two different forms across the biblical texts. 2 Samuel identifies him as Saph. The corresponding passage in the 4th verse of 1 Chronicles chapter 20 calls him Sippai. These variations most likely reflect differences in dialect or divergent scribal traditions, rather than referring to two separate individuals. Ancient Hebrew manuscripts sometimes displayed such inconsistencies, particularly for figures who weren't central to the narrative. The origin and meaning of the name remain matters of uncertainty. Some scholars link it to a root word meaning threshold or basin. Others propose possible Philistine origins given the warrior's association with Gath. The name's actual meaning carries less weight than the fact that it was preserved at all. Someone judged it significant to record this warrior's individual identity rather than leaving him as just another anonymous giant casualty. The battle took place at Gob. This location gets mentioned twice in 2 Samuel chapter 21. Once for the defeat of Saph, and again for the confrontation with Lahmi. The precise geographical site remains unidentified to this day. No archaeological sites have been definitively matched with biblical Gob. Some ancient manuscripts, including those of Chronicles, list the location as Gezer instead. This textual variation has generated scholarly discussion about which reading represents the original. Gezer was a significant Canaanite city that controlled vital routes connecting the coastal plain with the hill country. Archaeological work at Tel Gezer has uncovered enormous fortifications and evidence of Philistine occupation. The 10th chapter of Joshua mentions that Gezer's king came to assist Lachish against the Israelites. The 16th chapter of Joshua notes that the Israelites failed to drive out the Canaanites from Gezer, who continued living among the tribe of Ephraim. If the battle occurred at Gezer rather than Gob, this location suggests the conflict happened in contested border territory. Gezer sat at the edge of Philistine-controlled areas in land that both sides laid claim to. Battles in such locations frequently resulted from raiding parties, territorial disputes, or efforts to control trade routes. The presence of a giant warrior from Gath suggests the Philistines viewed this engagement as important enough to deploy their elite forces. On the other hand, if Gob represents a distinct location, perhaps a smaller settlement or a battlefield site in the vicinity, the name might have been recognizable to the original audience but became lost to later generations. Place names often survive only as long as the locations themselves remain inhabited or hold strategic importance. Abandoned sites fade from collective memory, leaving behind only textual references that subsequent readers cannot definitively place. Sibbecai, the Hushathite, gets credit for the victory. His designation as the Hushathite links him to Hushah, a town within the tribal territory assigned to Judah. First Chronicles mentions Hushah as a descendant of Judah through the line of Caleb. This geographical and tribal connection placed Sibbecai squarely within David's base of support in the hill country of Judea. Sibbecai shows up in other passages within Chronicles as one of David's elite warriors. The 11th chapter of 1 Chronicles lists him among the 30 chief warriors. The 27th chapter of 1 Chronicles identifies him as the commander of the 8th Division, which consisted of 24,000 men who served during the 8th month. His leadership over such a substantial force indicates considerable military expertise and organizational skill. The 23rd chapter of 2 Samuel, in its listing of David's 30 mighty men, doesn't mention Sibbecai specifically by this name. This absence has led some scholars to suggest he might be identified with one of the other names appearing in that roster, perhaps representing an alternate title or designation. Warriors in ancient times often carried multiple names or epithets that reflected their achievements or their origins. The verb describing Saph's defeat is Naka, the identical term used for Ishbi-Benob and the other giants. It indicates a lethal blow, a strike that brought death. The text offers no specifics about the combat itself. We don't learn what weapons Sibbecai employed. We don't discover details about Saph's armor or his fighting techniques. We don't find out whether this was a formal duel, an ambush, or combat amid a larger battle. This brevity might reflect the compiler's priorities. By the time this account was being assembled, the specific details of individual fights mattered less than the overarching pattern. The crucial information was that another giant from Gath had fallen to one of David's warriors. The cumulative impact of these victories interested the author more than the precise mechanics of each separate encounter. The phrase "descended from the giants" appears once more, maintaining the consistent formula for identification. Yeled Harafa links Saph directly to the same bloodline as Goliath and Ishbi-Benob. He wasn't just a random tall soldier. He belonged to the specific family line that stretched backward through the Anakim to the ancient Rephaim populations of Canaan. Saph's defeat continued the pattern that had been established with Ishbi-Benob. David's warriors, rather than David personally, were now handling the giant threats. The king's near-fatal experience had prompted this strategic adjustment. Rather than placing the lamp of Israel at risk through personal combat, the military was deploying proven warriors, capable of facing elite opponents. This approach distributed both the danger and the glory across the army's leadership structure. The time marker after this suggests a sequence of battles, rather than a single unified campaign. The conflicts with the Philistines extended across years, even spanning decades. Each encounter with a giant from Gath represented a separate incident in the ongoing struggle for control of territory. The giants weren't concentrated in one location, but appeared across different battles in varying contexts. This dispersed pattern indicates the giant warriors functioned as elite troops who were deployed wherever they were needed, rather than forming a single, cohesive unit. They might have commanded different Philistine contingents or been sent to respond to threats in various locations. Their strategic value derived partly from their mobility, from their ability to reinforce threatened positions or to lead assaults on Israelite-held territories. Saph's presence at Gob or Gezer also demonstrates that the giants actively took part in Philistine military operations. They weren't ceremonial figures or champions kept for parade purposes. They participated in actual combat, accepted real risks, and confronted real opposition. Their defeats, therefore, represented genuine battlefield losses for the Philistine war machine, not merely symbolic victories for the Israelites. The absence of detail regarding Saph's weaponry stands in contrast to the careful descriptions provided for Goliath, Ishbi-Benob, and Lahmi. Perhaps Saph carried equipment typical for his class. Perhaps the compiler assumed readers would infer similarity to other family members. Perhaps the original source material contained less information about this specific warrior. Whatever the explanation, Saph remains the most anonymous among the named brothers. Yet his anonymity serves a purpose. Not every giant required extensive introduction. Not every encounter demanded dramatic buildup. The very matter-of-fact way this is reported emphasizes how David's forces had adapted to confronting such enemies. What had once appeared impossible had become routine. The terror the Anakim had inspired in the generation of Moses, the fear that Goliath had provoked in Saul's army, had given way to professional military competence. Sibbechai's victory over Saph showed that defeating giants no longer required divine intervention through miraculous circumstances. It required skilled, battle-tested warriors performing their duties with effectiveness. The faith that had empowered David at Elah now expressed itself through trained soldiers carrying out their responsibilities. The same God who had guided a shepherd's stone now guided a warrior's weapon. For the people living in the hill country of Judea, particularly those from Hushah and the surrounding areas, Sibbechai's achievement would have held special meaning. He was one of them, a local man who had risen to command thousands, and who personally defeated one of the feared giants of Gath. His success validated the military system David had constructed and proved that ordinary men from ordinary towns could successfully face extraordinary challenges. Saph's death reduced the population of giants in Gath by one more. The roster of warriors from this legendary bloodline grew shorter still. Each loss made the subsequent battle more difficult for the Philistines, as their supply of elite champions dwindled. Each victory made the next battle easier for the Israelites, as confidence began to replace fear. The shift in military psychology held as much importance as the tactical outcomes on the battlefield. The brother at Gath, the unnamed giant with 12 fingers and 12 toes. Some warriors earn remembrance for their victories, others for their weapons. This particular giant is remembered for his physical anatomy. The 20th and 21st verses of 2 Samuel chapter 21 introduce him with noteworthy detail. And there was again war at Gath, where there was a man of great stature, who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 inches number. And he also was descended from the giants. The text meticulously counts his digits. 6 fingers on each hand totals 12 fingers. 6 toes on each foot totals 12 toes. Combined, 24 digits rather than the standard 20. This condition, referred to medically as polydactyly, occurs naturally within human populations. Modern research estimates prevalence at roughly 1 inch, 700 to 1,000 live births. Polydactyly can appear in various forms. Some instances involve fully functional extra digits, complete with bone structure, joints, and muscle control. Other instances present partially formed digits, sometimes merely skin tags or small protrusions. The biblical text doesn't specify which type this warrior possessed. The fact that his extra digits warranted mention suggests they were substantial enough to be visually noticeable and distinctive. The condition frequently runs in families, inherited through autosomal dominant genes. If one parent carries the trait, each child has roughly a 50% chance of inheriting it. This genetic pattern explains how polydactyly might concentrate within a specific bloodline. If the giant populations of Gath practiced endogamy, marrying within their own group to maintain their distinctive characteristics, such traits could become more common. Ancient cultures interpreted physical abnormalities through different lenses. Some regarded them as divine signs, others viewed them as marks of special destiny or power. Still others considered them curses or ill omens. The biblical text presents this giant's extra digits in a straightforward manner, as identifying information rather than moral judgment. The digits made him recognizable, marked him as belonging to a particular lineage. The phrase "man of great stature" translates the Hebrew Ishbi-Benob, literally man of measure or man of size. This conveys notable height without providing exact measurements. The text emphasizes physical presence rather than numerical precision. Combined with the distinctive digits, the description creates a picture of an imposing figure who would stand out even among other warriors. The battle occurred at Gath itself, the home base of these giant warriors. Earlier encounters had happened at various locations across the borderlands. This one brought the conflict to the giant stronghold. Whether the Israelites launched an attack on Gath, or the battle occurred in nearby territory claimed by that city, remains unclear. What matters is the geographical link. This warrior fought on, or very close to his home ground. Verse 21 provides behavioral detail. And when he taunted Israel, Jonathan the son of Shimea, David's brother, struck him down. The verb chereph appears again, the same root word used for Goliath's taunting in the 17th chapter of 1 Samuel. This giant followed family tradition, hurling insults and challenges at the Israelite forces. The cultural practice of verbal combat before actual fighting, common throughout ancient Near Eastern warfare, continued into the next generation. Taunting fulfilled multiple functions in ancient combat. It demonstrated courage and self-assurance. It demoralized opponents. It established social hierarchy and claims to honor. It sometimes provoked enemies into making rash decisions. A warrior skilled in taunting could shift the psychological advantage before weapons ever made contact. This giant had apparently learned these techniques, perhaps from Goliath himself, if their lives overlapped chronologically, or from family teaching that preserved such methods. Jonathan receives identification as the son of Shimea, David's brother. This genealogical detail has caused some puzzlement. In other passages, David's brother is called Shammah or Shimei. The name variations likely represent differences in dialect or scribal tradition. What remains constant is the family connection. Jonathan was David's nephew, part of the extended family network that formed the core of David's military leadership. This Jonathan should not be mistaken for Jonathan, son of Saul, David's famous friend from earlier in the narrative. That Jonathan had been killed at Mount Gilboa decades before these encounters with giants. This later Jonathan, David's nephew, belonged to a different generation. His role in defeating the final named giant parallels the contributions other family members made to eliminating this threat. The text doesn't provide details about the mechanics of combat. We don't learn what weapons Jonathan used, or how the fight developed. We don't discover whether this was a formal single combat, an opportunistic attack, or a confrontation within a larger battle. The compiler considered the outcome sufficient information. Another giant from the bloodline had fallen. Another of David's family members had proven capable of facing such enemies. The giant's extra digits raise intriguing questions about effectiveness in combat. Did they offer any advantage? 12 fingers might have provided enhanced grip strength on weapons or shields. 12 toes might have improved balance and footwork. Conversely, the extra digits might have created difficulties with standard equipment designed for typical human anatomy. Gloves, if they were worn, would have required custom fitting. Footwear would have needed adaptation. Ancient armor and weapons were often custom-made for elite warriors anyway. A fighter of this giant's stature and status would have had equipment tailored to his specific physique. The extra digits would simply represent one additional specification for the craftsman creating his gear. In this sense, his unusual anatomy might not have significantly affected his combat capability, though it certainly made him memorable. The preservation of this anatomical detail in the biblical record points toward eyewitness testimony. Someone observed this warrior closely enough to count his digits. Someone judged the information worth recording. Someone ensured it passed into the written sources that eventually became scripture. The specificity argues against legendary embellishment and points toward historical documentation. Medical historians note that polydactyly appears in skeletal remains from various ancient populations. While not common, it wasn't vanishingly rare. The condition is compatible with normal life expectancy and physical activity. There's no reason to doubt that a warrior could possess extra digits and still function as an effective combatant. The biblical account aligns with biological possibility. For the original audience, this giant's distinctive feature might have served a practical function. In a world without photographs or detailed written descriptions, identifying individual warriors in battle or in accounts of battle presented real challenges. Physical markers like unusual height, specific weapons, or anatomical distinctiveness helped differentiate one fighter from another in oral tradition and written records. The unnamed status of this giant is curious. Unlike his brothers Ishbi-Benob, Saf, and Lahmi, He receives no personal name in the surviving text. Perhaps his name was lost during transmission. Perhaps the extra digits were considered sufficient for identification. Perhaps his name never held the same significance as his distinctive physical trait. In collective memory, he became the one with 12 fingers and 12 toes, rather than someone specifically named as a brother or son. His defeat by Jonathan completed the pattern of David's extended family, systematically eliminating the giant threat. David himself had defeated Goliath. David's nephew Abishai had rescued David from Ishbi-Benob. David's warriors Sibbecai and Elhanan had defeated Saph and Lahmi. Now David's nephew Jonathan defeated the final brother. The campaign had truly become a family undertaking, with multiple generations of David's lineage participating in removing this ancient enemy. The location at Gath for this final encounter carries symbolic significance. The city that had bred these warriors, that had given them sanctuary after Joshua's conquest, that had merged Anakim heritage with Philistine military culture, finally witnessed its champion lineage ended on its own territory. The giant stronghold could no longer produce warriors capable of intimidating the Israelite forces. The legendary bloodline had reached its endpoint. Lahmi, the brother of Goliath. Among all the giants who fell to David's warriors, only one receives explicit identification as Goliath's brother. The 5th verse of 1 Chronicles chapter 20 states plainly, "And there was again war with the Philistines, and Elhanan, the son of Jair, struck down Lahmi, the brother of Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam." The name Lahmi appears only in this verse, throughout all of Scripture. Its etymology likely connects to lechem, the Hebrew word for bread. Whether this represents his actual given name, or perhaps a nickname, remains uncertain. The linguistic connection to Bethlehem, which means house of bread, is striking, but may be merely coincidental. What matters is that Chronicles preserves his identity as specifically and undeniably Goliath's brother. His weapon receives the same description as Goliath's, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. This phrase appears 3 times in the biblical accounts of giants from Gath. 1 Samuel chapter 17 uses it for Goliath. Chronicles uses it for Lahmi. The parallel passage in 2 Samuel chapter 21, despite textual corruption regarding Lahmi's identity, also includes this distinctive description. The comparison to a weaver's beam refers to the wooden rod used in ancient looms. These beams needed to be straight, strong, and substantial enough to support the tension of warp threads during the weaving process. They were typically fashioned from dense hardwood, shaped to the appropriate thickness. The comparison suggests spear shafts of unusual diameter and weight, capable of supporting large iron points without bending or breaking under stress. That both Goliath and Lahmi carried such distinctive weapons suggests family tradition or specialized training. Perhaps their father or other relatives taught them a specific fighting style that emphasized heavy spears. Perhaps the warriors of Gath specialized in this type of weapon, developing techniques to maximize its advantages. Perhaps the family maintained access to craftsmen who were skilled in producing such equipment. Whatever the origin, the weaver's beam spears became something of a signature for this bloodline. Elhanan, son of Jair, receives credit for defeating Lahmi. His name means God is gracious, a common Hebrew formation that combines El, meaning God, with Chanan, meaning to be gracious. His father's name, Jair, connects to a root meaning he enlightens or he shines. These names place Elhanan firmly within Israelite culture and covenant identity. The parallel passage in the 19th verse of 2 Samuel chapter 21 creates textual complexity. That verse reads, "And there was again war with the Philistines at Gob. And Elhanan, the son of Jaare-Oregim, the Bethlehemite, struck down Goliath, the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam." This appears to credit Elhanan with defeating Goliath himself, directly contradicting 1 Samuel chapter 17, where David achieved that victory. This contradiction has puzzled readers across millennia. Ancient Jewish commentators proposed various solutions. Some suggested Elhanan was another name for David, though this lacks any supporting evidence. Others proposed that multiple giants bore the name Goliath, which seems unlikely. Medieval scholars sometimes argued for scribal error, which turned out to be correct. The Chronicles passage resolves the problem by inserting two crucial words, Lahmi and brother. Textual scholars have analyzed how the Samuel verse became corrupted. The Hebrew text of 2 Samuel contains what appears to be a scribal duplication. The word oregim in Jare oregim matches the word oregim, meaning weavers, in the phrase about the spear. A scribe's eye apparently jumped from one occurrence to another, causing text to be omitted. Additionally, the Hebrew letters in Lahmi are similar to those in Bethlehemite. In ancient Hebrew script, which originally lacked vowel points and used some ambiguous letter forms, confusion between similar-looking words could occur during the copying process. A scribe might have misread Lahmi brother of as part of Bethlehemite, especially if the text was damaged or unclear in his source manuscript. Chronicles, compiled later and drawing from multiple sources, preserved the correct reading. The chronicler had access to records that maintained the distinction between Goliath and his brother. When Chronicles was written, probably during or after the Babylonian exile, the authors were working to create an accurate historical record for the restored community. They compared sources and resolved contradictions when possible. This textual history demonstrates both the challenges of ancient manuscript transmission and the reliability of having parallel accounts. Scribal errors did occur. Text could be corrupted through copying mistakes, but when multiple versions existed, scholars could identify problems and reconstruct original readings. The preservation of both Samuel and Chronicles allows modern readers to understand what actually happened. The fact that Elhanan defeated Lahmi rather than Goliath also makes narrative sense. David's victory over Goliath launched his public career. It established his reputation. It fulfilled Samuel's anointing. It demonstrated divine favor. That victory belonged uniquely to David. The idea that someone else actually defeated Goliath would undermine the entire structure of David's rise to power. Lahmi's role as Goliath's actual brother adds emotional dimension to the encounter. This wasn't simply another tall warrior from Gath. This was family. When Lahmi entered battle, he carried personal motivation beyond standard Philistine military objectives. His brother had fallen to an Israelite champion. Honor might demand vengeance. Family loyalty might compel action. The psychological stakes exceeded those of normal combat. Elhanan faced a warrior, potentially driven by grief and anger. Lahmi wasn't simply following orders or seeking glory. He was confronting the nation that had taken his brother's life. This emotional element could make him more dangerous, more unpredictable, more determined. A warrior fighting for family honor often displays extra ferocity and disregard for personal safety, yet Elhanan prevailed. The mighty man of David, whose name proclaimed God's grace, struck down the brother of the most famous giant in biblical history. This victory demonstrated that David's success at Elah wasn't unrepeatable fortune. It was the beginning of a pattern. The Israelite forces, empowered by faith and skill, could consistently defeat the giant warriors of Gath. The location of this battle receives less attention than other encounters. Chronicles doesn't specify where Lahmi fell. The corrupted Samuel text mentions Gob, but whether this applies to Lahmi's defeat remains uncertain given the textual problems. What matters more than geography is the fact of defeat. Another warrior from the giant bloodline had been removed from the battlefield. Lahmi's death carried particular symbolic weight because of his explicit connection to Goliath. As long as Goliath's actual brother survived and fought, the shadow of that first giant remained present. The family line persisted. The potential for a new champion from that same stock still existed. Lahmi's defeat closed that particular chapter more definitively than the other brothers' falls could have done. For the Philistines, losing Lahmi meant losing a warrior with a direct claim to Goliath's legacy. This wasn't a distant relative or clan member. This was Goliath's brother, presumably trained alongside him, perhaps taught by the same mentors, certainly shaped by the same warrior culture. His combat style might have mirrored Goliath's. His tactics might have echoed his brother's approach. Defeating him proved the Israelites could handle even the closest approximation to the original giant threat. The fact that Elhanan accomplished this, rather than David, mirrors the earlier pattern. David had proven himself against the first and greatest giant. His warriors then proved themselves against the remaining family members. This distribution of victories built confidence throughout the Israelite military hierarchy. It wasn't about relying on one champion. It was about cultivating a culture of faith and competence that could produce multiple giant slayers. Elhanan's background as a Bethlehemite, preserved even in the corrupted Samuel text, creates interesting symmetry. Bad-en-Shusifan. David's origins trace back to Bethlehem. Elhanan also hailed from Bethlehem. The same town that gave rise to the shepherd king likewise gave rise to the warrior who brought down the giant king's brother. This shared geography hints that Bethlehem fostered a distinctive type of courage, or perhaps faith. The very place where David spent his formative years produced additional individuals capable of comparable achievements. The spear, resembling a weaver's beam, ceased its active service. The characteristic weapon of Lahmi, which had presumably claimed numerous victims, now lay dormant. The craftspeople who manufactured such implements lost one of their patrons. The specialized skills required for handling these enormous spears would shortly lack anyone to practice them. The martial heritage of the giant warriors from Gath was drawing to a close, one defeated brother at a time. Resolving a puzzling discrepancy, Elhanan and the killing of Goliath. Throughout the centuries, those who study Scripture carefully and readers who pay close attention have observed a perplexing contradiction within the text. 1 Samuel Chapter 17 unambiguously declares that David defeated Goliath, the Gittite. However, 2 Samuel chapter 21, verse 19, seems to attribute this identical triumph to Elhanan, the son of Jaare-Oregim. How is it possible for both narratives to be accurate? The pertinent section from 2 Samuel states, "And there was again war with the Philistines at Gob, and Elhanan, the son of Jaare-Oregim, the Bethlehemite, struck down Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam." The sentence structure is uncomplicated. The grammatical construction is transparent. Elhanan killed Goliath. This appears to directly contradict the renowned story familiar to every reader. Commentators from ancient times put forward a variety of solutions. Within Jewish tradition, some propose that Elhanan represented an alternate name for David. Throughout the ancient world, kings and heroes frequently possessed multiple names or designations. It's possible that David was known as Elhanan in particular situations. This hypothesis, though inventive, finds no corroborating evidence anywhere else in biblical literature. David is never identified as Elhanan in any other passage. A different suggestion maintained that two separate giants bore the name Goliath. Perhaps Goliath functioned as a title or military designation instead of being a personal name. Perhaps Gath produced several warriors who carried this name across successive generations. This hypothesis encounters the difficulty that the biblical narrative treats Goliath as one specific individual, not as a title. The elaborate description of his armor and armaments in 1 Samuel points toward a particular person, not a general designation. Certain commentators adopted a more questioning stance, proposing that the texts reflected rival traditions regarding who genuinely defeated the famous giant. According to this perspective, different communities or source materials preserve different heroes for the same accomplishment. Subsequently, editors compiled these competing narratives without completely harmonizing them. This methodology, while explaining the discrepancy, generates wider questions concerning biblical dependability. The genuine solution emerges from meticulous comparison with 1 Chronicles. Chronicles, chapter 20, verse 5, offers a parallel narrative with essential differences. "And there was again war with the Philistines, and Elhanan, the son of Jair, struck down Lahmi, the brother of Goliath, the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam." In this account, Elhanan defeats not Goliath himself, but rather Lahmi, who is explicitly identified as Goliath's brother. This reading from Chronicles immediately resolves the contradiction. Elhanan did indeed strike down a giant from Gath whose spear resembled a weaver's beam, but that giant was Lahmi, Goliath's brother, not Goliath himself. The text in 2 Samuel experienced corruption during transmission, losing the words that identified the victim as Lahmi and specified his family relationship to Goliath. How did this textual corruption take place? Hebrew manuscripts underwent hand copying for many centuries before printing technology emerged. Scribes from time to time made errors. Individual letters might be misinterpreted, particularly in damaged or unclear source materials. Words could accidentally be left out when a scribe's vision jumped from one similar phrase to another similar phrase. Given the repetitive character of the giant descriptions, such mistakes became increasingly probable. Analysis of the text reveals the mechanics involved. The Hebrew term for Bethlehemite shares multiple letters with Lahmi. In ancient Hebrew script, which initially employed only consonants without vowel markings, the resemblance would be even more striking. A scribe working from damaged text materials might misread Lahmi, brother of, as components of the word signifying Bethlehemite. Furthermore, the name Jare-Oregim in Samuel appears questionable. Oregim represents the Hebrew word for weavers in its plural construction. This identical word appears subsequently in the verse within the phrase, weaver's beam. A scribe's eye could have caught this word from later within the sentence and inadvertently incorporated it into the name Jair. The Chronicles reading provides simply Jair, without the additional element. These mechanical explanations for scribal mistakes are thoroughly documented within textual criticism. Ancient manuscripts display various kinds of copying errors. The presence of similar words positioned close together, technical terminology appearing multiple times, and damaged source materials all contribute to the likelihood of error. The passage in 2 Samuel exhibits signs of precisely these difficulties. Chronicles, compiled at a later date and drawing from multiple source materials, had the opportunity to compare different manuscript traditions. The chronicler, or the chroniclers, worked toward creating an accurate historical account. When they discovered contradictions between sources, they made efforts to resolve them. In this particular case, they preserved the reading that maintained consistency with the broader narrative, while simultaneously recording Elhanan's noteworthy victory. The timing of Chronicles' composition lends support to this explanation. The majority of scholars assign Chronicles to the post-exilic period, following the return from Babylonian captivity. The authors were working approximately 4 to 5 centuries following David's reign. They possessed access to royal archives, temple documentation, and multiple manuscript traditions that had survived Jerusalem's destruction. Their endeavor involved synthesizing these sources into a coherent historical account. The books of Samuel, in contrast, reached their final form at an earlier time, possibly during the period of the divided monarchy. The textual tradition had less time available to identify and rectify errors. When copies of Samuel were produced, scribal mistakes could have been perpetuated if the error existed within an early authoritative manuscript. Once an error penetrated the mainstream textual tradition, it could endure for multiple generations. Contemporary textual criticism has developed methodologies for identifying such difficulties. When parallel passages exist, scholars make comparisons. They examine ancient translations, such as the Septuagint, to determine what Hebrew texts those translators were utilizing. They analyze manuscript families to trace the history of textual variation. They apply linguistic expertise to identify irregularities that suggest corruption. In this particular case, the evidence overwhelmingly favors the Chronicles reading. Lahmi was Goliath's brother. Elhanan defeated Lahmi. The text in Samuel suffered corruption that transformed Lahmi, brother of Goliath, into simply Goliath. This corruption generated an apparent contradiction with 1 Samuel, chapter 17. However, the original text, preserved in Chronicles, contained no such contradiction. This resolution carries significance for multiple reasons. First, it preserves the integrity of the David and Goliath narrative. David's triumph at Elah remains unchallenged. His position as the giant slayer who initiated a military and political career stands firmly established. the theological importance of young David confronting the Philistine champion with faith alone remains intact. Second, it demonstrates the worth of possessing multiple biblical narratives. When Samuel and Chronicles run parallel to each other, the existence of both permits comparison and correction. Apparent contradictions can find resolution through careful examination. The biblical text becomes more reliable when we comprehend transmission history and can pinpoint where difficulties arose. Third, it validates Elhanan's personal achievement. He defeated a significant adversary, a warrior originating from the same family as Goliath, a man who wielded the same distinctive weapon. Lahmi was not merely any ordinary Philistine soldier. He was Goliath's brother, trained within the same traditions, part of the same feared lineage. Elhanan's victory merits acknowledgement without incorrectly crediting him with David's accomplishment. Fourth, it demonstrates the significance of preserving precise details. The fact that Lahmi is specifically designated as Goliath's brother has importance. It establishes the familial connection. It clarifies why this particular giant warranted special attention within the biblical record. It assists readers in understanding the methodical nature of David's campaign against this warrior dynasty. The scribal error in Samuel, while noteworthy, does not compromise the overall trustworthiness of the biblical text. Ancient manuscripts underwent copying by human hands, and humans commit mistakes. What has importance is that the wider manuscript tradition, including parallel narratives and different textual witnesses, permits these errors to be identified and corrected. The Bible contains its own verification mechanism through its multiple books and sources. For contemporary readers, this example functions as a reminder to read with care and compare parallel passages. When apparent contradictions surface, investigating more deeply often uncovers resolution. The books of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles frequently address the same events from different viewpoints or with different details. These variations typically complement rather than contradict one another when properly comprehended. The story of Lahmi also reminds us that biblical history concentrates on theological significance rather than exhaustive detail. The chroniclers documented what held importance for understanding God's work throughout David's reign. The defeat of the giant brothers mattered because it illustrated divine faithfulness and the fulfillment of the conquest mandate. Whether every detail of every battle received preservation mattered less than capturing the overall pattern and significance. Elhanan emerges from this textual confusion as an authentic historical figure who performed a genuine and significant deed. He struck down Lahmi, Goliath's brother, continuing the methodical elimination of the giant bloodline. His name deserves remembrance alongside Sibbecai, Abishai, and Jonathan as one among David's warriors who confronted the descendants of the Anakim and triumphed. The final giants, the conclusion of an era in Canaan. The elimination of Goliath's brothers represented more than military triumphs. It signified the conclusion of a conflict that commenced when Israelite scouts first observed the Anakim in Canaan's hill country. For centuries, these populations had symbolized obstacles to divine promise. Their removal indicated fundamental transformation in the land. Joshua, chapters 14 through 15, chronicles the beginning of this ending. Caleb, at that time 85 years of age, requested from Joshua the hill country where the Anakim resided. He had scouted that territory 45 years previously. Unlike others in his generation, he had not feared these giants. Now, in his advanced years, he requested the honor of expelling them. Joshua blessed him and designated Hebron as his inheritance. Caleb accomplished his request. He expelled the 3 sons of Anak, Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai. These were the specific names the scouts had reported in Numbers, chapter 13. For 4.5 decades, these particular individuals, or their descendants, had occupied Hebron. Caleb's victory was personal in nature, completing what he had desired to accomplish since his youth. Nevertheless, Caleb's accomplishment, though significant, was not total. Joshua, chapter 11, verse 22, observes that while Joshua destroyed most Anakim populations in the hill country, some remained within 3 Philistine cities, Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. These survivors discovered refuge in territories that would shortly accommodate the sea peoples migrating from the Mediterranean. The Philistine occupation established safe havens where the Anakim could continue existing. This geographical detail explains why the giant problem resurfaced during the time of Saul and David. The Anakim populations within Philistine cities had multiple generations to reorganize, intermarry, and integrate into their host society. They brought their physical stature and warrior traditions into Philistine military frameworks. The fusion created the elite champion class that included Goliath and his brothers. The strategic ramifications were severe. The Philistines already possessed superior ironworking technology. They controlled essential coastal routes and productive agricultural plains. Adding giants to their military forces multiplied their advantages. These warriors could function as shock troops, shattering enemy formations. They could operate as champions in single combat, as Goliath attempted. They could supply psychological intimidation that demoralized adversaries before battle commenced. David's campaign against these warriors therefore addressed both immediate and historical challenges. In the immediate sense, he was eliminating threats to his kingdom's security. Historically, he was completing the conquest mandate that Joshua initiated and that Caleb advanced. The promised land was intended to be cleared of its original inhabitants. The surviving Anakim in Philistine territory represented unfinished business from the initial settlement. The systematic character of the giant eliminations suggests intentional strategy. 5 warriors from the Gath bloodline fell during David's reign. The timing extended across years, indicating multiple campaigns rather than a single operation. David approached this as an ongoing project, not merely a series of battles. He was systematically removing a category of threat rather than responding reactively to individual challenges. This strategic methodology required patience. Giants did not conveniently assemble in one location for elimination. They appeared in different contexts, at different times, in different battles. David needed to sustain focus across years while managing numerous other threats to his kingdom. The Philistines were not his sole enemies. Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Arameans, all demanded military attention. Nevertheless, David ensured that whenever giant warriors appeared, his forces stood ready. The empowerment of his warriors proved essential. David could not personally confront every giant. His near-death experience with Ishbi-Benob demonstrated that. Instead, he developed a military culture where elite warriors could manage such adversaries. Abishai, Sibbecai, Elhanan, and Jonathan all proved themselves capable of defeating giant opponents. This distribution of capability meant the mission did not depend upon David's personal combat effectiveness. The theological dimension cannot be disregarded. The Anakim had constituted the test that the Exodus generation failed. Their presence inspired such fear that the entire congregation lost confidence in God's promise. Numbers, chapter 14, documents divine judgment. Because they refused to enter the land after seeing the giants, that generation would perish in the wilderness. Only Joshua and Caleb, who maintained faith, would survive to enter. The giants thus represented a specific type of spiritual challenge. Would God's people place trust in him when facing intimidating obstacles? Would they believe his promises despite apparent impossibilities? The first generation answered negatively. Joshua's generation answered affirmatively, but only partially, leaving pockets of giants in Philistine cities. David's generation finally answered with complete commitment, eliminating every identified giant warrior. This progression demonstrates how divine purposes operate across time. The promise was granted to Abraham. The conquest commenced under Joshua. The completion awaited David. Each generation advanced the work to the degree their faith and capability permitted. David benefited from the groundwork established by his predecessors. They faced more difficult circumstances with less preparation. He faced the remnant with a trained army and proven tactics. The conclusion of the giant bloodline also signified the end of a particular style of warfare, champion combat, where individual warriors determined battles through single combat, became less practical. The Philistines could no longer deploy intimidating giants who might secure wars without full army engagement. Future conflicts would depend more heavily on tactics, equipment, and organized military movements, rather than on individual warrior prowess. Archaeological evidence from this time period reveals changes in warfare patterns throughout the region. Fortification styles evolved. Weapon varieties diversified. Military organization became more sophisticated. The era when individual champions could determine outcomes was yielding to more systematic approaches to conflict. The giant warriors represented the old model. David's military represented the emerging paradigm. For the populations of Canaan, these developments meant improved security. Random raids by champion warriors diminished. The terror associated with confronting giants faded away. Communities could concentrate more on agriculture, trade, and normal life, rather than living under constant military threat. The removal of these warriors created space for economic and social development. The timing aligned with David's consolidation of his kingdom. As he secured his borders, defeated surrounding enemies, and established administrative systems, the elimination of internal threats, like the giant warriors, complemented his broader state-building endeavor. A stable kingdom required removing destabilizing elements. The giants qualified as precisely such elements. The three Philistine cities mentioned in Joshua, chapter 11, Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod, all experienced different fates. Gath, the giant stronghold, was eventually destroyed. Archaeological excavations at Tel Es-Safi revealed destruction layers from the 9th century BCE. By the time of the prophets, Gath had diminished in significance. Gaza and Ashdod continued as important cities, but without their giant populations, they posed different types of threats. The biblical narrative demonstrates awareness of this transition. Earlier texts portray the giants as widespread and numerous. Later texts portray them as remnants and survivors. Finally, accounts from David's reign portray them as individuals who can be named and enumerated. The population had declined from a broad demographic presence to a specialized military elite, to isolated warriors, to nothing. The pattern reveals systematic reduction across generations. 2 Samuel, chapter 21, verse 22, supplies the summary. These four were descended from the giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. 4 specific encounters are documented in that chapter, beyond the original Goliath battle. The number suggests comprehensiveness. These were not random samples, but rather the complete roster of remaining giant warriors from that bloodline. The phrase, "fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants," distributes credit appropriately. David initiated the campaign by defeating Goliath. His example and leadership inspired and equipped others to continue the work. The victories belonged to him strategically, even when his warriors accomplished them tactically. This represents proper military attribution, recognizing both command and execution. The impact on Israelite confidence cannot be overstated. The people who once compared themselves to grasshoppers before the giants now employed warriors who routinely defeated such enemies. The psychological shift transformed national identity. Fear yielded to faith-based courage. Paralysis yielded to effective action. The change validated the belief that God fought for his people when they placed trust in him. This confidence enabled subsequent military successes. David's campaigns against surrounding nations benefited from an army that had faced and defeated the most intimidating enemies conceivable. If his warriors could handle giants, they could handle anyone. The battles against Moab, Ammon, Edom, and Aram all proceeded from this foundation of proven capability. The completion of the giant elimination also freed prophetic imagination. Later biblical texts could refer back to this achievement as demonstration of divine faithfulness. When prophets wanted to encourage faith when facing overwhelming odds, they pointed to David's victories. When teachers wanted to illustrate the power of trusting God, they referenced the shepherd boy who faced the giant. The story became parable and inspiration for future generations. Nevertheless, the memory of the giants persisted in Israelite consciousness. They remained in legend and teaching even after disappearing from reality. The fear they once inspired served as a benchmark for describing other threats. Prophets compared enemy armies to giants. Psalmists referenced them in prayers for deliverance. The giants became symbolic of any overwhelming challenge that requires divine intervention to overcome. This symbolic usage demonstrates how thoroughly they had been defeated. They could serve as metaphors, precisely because they no longer posed actual threat. The transformation from present danger to past example marked complete victory. David and his warriors had not merely defeated individual enemies. They had eliminated an entire category of threat that had menaced the region for centuries. The land finally rested from the giant presence. The cities they had occupied returned to normal habitation. The trade routes they had threatened opened to commerce. The fear they inspired dissolved into history. Canaan entered a new era, one where the ancient inhabitants, who had resisted the Israelite settlement, were finally completely removed from power. Giants in myth and memory, the legacy of the Gittite bloodline. The story of Goliath transcended its historical moment to become one of humanity's most enduring narratives. His name entered common language as shorthand for any overwhelming obstacle. David and Goliath became proverbial for unlikely victory against impossible odds. Yet while Goliath achieved immortality in cultural memory, his brothers faded into obscurity. Understanding this divergence reveals how stories get shaped and preserved. The power of the David and Goliath narrative comes from its archetypal structure. Young versus old, small versus large, faith versus pride, unexpected versus established. These contrasts create memorable drama. The shepherd boy with a sling confronting the armored giant creates visual imagery that transcends culture and language. Artists across centuries have depicted the scene. Writers have retold it. Teachers have employed it to illustrate principles about courage and faith. The brothers' stories lack these dramatic elements. They were defeated by trained warriors, not shepherd boys. They fell in routine military encounters rather than formal single combat before assembled armies. Their defeats were tactically significant but lacked the theological and narrative weight of David's victory at Elah. No prophet anointed Sibbecai beforehand. No army watched Elhanan approach with only a sling. The circumstances were different. Jewish tradition preserved some additional details about the giants of Gath. The Talmud, compiled centuries after the biblical events, includes discussions about the Anakim and their descendants. Some rabbinic sources expanded on their origins, connecting them to the Nephilim of Genesis, chapter 6. Others focused on their moral character, portraying them as arrogant and opposed to divine purposes. These interpretations show how later generations processed the biblical accounts. The Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of Hebrew scriptures, completed around 250 BCE, made choices in translating giant-related terminology. It rendered Nephilim as gigantes, giving us the English word giants. It standardized measurements that varied in Hebrew manuscripts. These translation decisions influenced how Greek-speaking Jewish communities and later Christian readers understood the biblical giants. Early Christian interpreters saw typological significance in David's victory. David became a type of Christ, defeating Satan, represented by Goliath. The stone from the brook represented the stone rejected by builders that became the cornerstone. The 5 smooth stones represented the 5 books of Torah. These allegorical readings, while not reflecting original authorial intent, show how influential the story became in Christian theological imagination. Medieval Jewish commentators like Rashi and Ibn Ezra discussed the textual problems in Samuel regarding Elhanan. They noticed the contradiction with Chronicles and proposed various solutions. Their work preserved scholarly awareness of these issues long before modern textual criticism developed its methods. The giant stories became test cases for how to handle apparent scriptural discrepancies. Apocryphal and pseudepigraphal texts elaborated on giant lore. The Book of Enoch, not included in most biblical canons, expanded the Genesis 6 Nephilim account into extensive mythology about fallen angels and their giant offspring. These traditions influenced Jewish apocalyptic literature and some early Christian writings. While not directly about Goliath's brothers, they show the broader cultural fascination with giants in biblical tradition. Renaissance artists favored the David and Goliath story. Michelangelo's famous statue depicts David before the battle, sling over shoulder, gaze focused on his opponent. Donatello created an earlier bronze David, standing victoriously over Goliath's severed head. Caravaggio painted the aftermath, showing young David holding the giant's head. These masterworks ensured the story remained central to Western art for centuries. The brothers, meanwhile, received no such attention. No famous sculptures depict Sibbachai facing Saph. No paintings immortalize Elhanan's victory over Lahmi. No artistic tradition developed around Abishai, rescuing David from Ishbi-Benob. The lack of visual representation contributed to their obscurity. Stories without images fade faster from collective memory, especially in eras when most people could not read. Literature across cultures retold the David and Goliath story. It appeared in children's books, moral tales, adventure stories, and psychological studies. Malcolm Gladwell's modern bestseller, David and Goliath, re-examined the story through the lens of advantage and disadvantage, arguing David actually had tactical superiority. Such reinterpretations keep the story alive for new generations and contexts. The brothers' stories, by contrast, appear mainly in scholarly works and detailed biblical commentaries. They interest historians and theologians more than general readers. This specialization limits their cultural penetration. Stories that remain academic rarely achieve the widespread recognition that popular narratives enjoy. Nevertheless, the brothers' obscurity does not diminish their significance. They represent the unglamorous work of completing a mission. David's victory at Elah was spectacular. The subsequent defeats of Goliath's brothers were necessary. Headline achievements need follow-through. Celebrity moments require systematic implementation. The brothers' defeats ensured that David's famous victory translated into lasting strategic benefit. This pattern appears throughout biblical narrative. Abraham received the promise. Isaac maintained it. Jacob struggled with it. Joseph preserved it through famine. Moses liberated the people. Joshua led them into the land. Judges defended them. Samuel transitioned them to monarchy. David consolidated the kingdom. Each generation built on previous work, often doing less celebrated but equally necessary tasks. The giant elimination campaign fits this pattern. Goliath's defeat opened possibilities. His brothers' defeats secured those possibilities. The 5 victories together accomplished what one victory alone could not. This is how divine purposes typically advance, through accumulated faithfulness across time, not through isolated moments of drama. Modern interpreters sometimes focus exclusively on the famous David and Goliath story, missing the broader context. They treat it as allegory about faith overcoming obstacles without recognizing the historical campaign it initiated. They extract spiritual principles without understanding the military and political realities. The brothers' stories provide grounding, showing how the initial victory led to sustained effort and complete success. The geographic concentration of these warriors in Gath deserves attention. Why did one city produce all 5 giants? The answer likely combines genetics, culture, and historical circumstance. Gath harbored Anakim survivors after Joshua's conquest. These populations maintained distinct identity even after Philistine occupation. Intermarriage within the group preserved physical characteristics. Military culture valued and cultivated warrior skills. Generations of selection created a specialized elite. This phenomenon has parallels in other ancient cultures. Sparta developed specialized warrior culture. Rome cultivated military excellence across generations. Various peoples produced warriors with distinctive characteristics and methods. Gath was not unique in creating elite soldiers, only in maintaining a bloodline connected to the pre-conquest inhabitants of Canaan. The symbolism of giants persists in modern consciousness. We speak of slaying giants to describe overcoming major challenges. We call dominant competitors giants in their industries. We use Goliath to represent any seemingly unbeatable opponent. This metaphorical usage shows the story's enduring power. It has become language, not just narrative. Yet the metaphorical usage often oversimplifies. The biblical giants were real warriors who required real military responses. They were not merely psychological barriers or internal fears. They were external threats with weapons and training. Reducing them to pure symbolism misses the historical reality that David's generation faced actual, dangerous enemies who needed to be defeated through actual combat. The balance between literal and symbolic understanding enriches interpretation. Yes, giants represent overwhelming challenges that require faith to overcome. Yes, David's victory models, trusting God in impossible circumstances. But also, giants were real. They had families. They participated in wars. They were systematically eliminated through sustained military campaign. Both levels matter. The Forgotten Brothers teach humility about fame. Ishbi-Benob nearly achieved what Goliath could not, ending David's life. Yet most readers do not know his name. Lahmi carried the same distinctive spear as his famous brother. Few remember him. The unnamed giant with 12 fingers and 12 toes had the most unusual physical characteristic. He remains anonymous to most. Fame depends on context and narrative structure as much as on achievement. This reality applies beyond ancient warfare. History remembers those whose stories fit memorable patterns. It forgets those whose contributions, while significant, do not translate into compelling narrative. The brothers' obscurity does not reflect their irrelevance. It reflects how memory works, how stories are preserved, and what kinds of accounts capture imagination across generations. The ultimate legacy of the Gittite bloodline is its absence. They no longer exist. Their warrior culture ended. Their genetic line disappeared or merged into other populations. Their distinctive characteristics no longer appear. The giant problem that plagued the Israelites from the time of the spies through the time of Saul reached complete resolution. That absence is itself the achievement, the proof that the campaign succeeded. Contemporary readers encountering these stories must balance multiple perspectives. We read for historical understanding, seeking to grasp what actually happened in ancient Canaan. We read for theological meaning, discovering how God works through human action across time. We read for practical application, learning principles about faith, perseverance, and completing necessary tasks. All three approaches have value. Together, they honor both the text and the real people whose lives it records. The story of Goliath's brothers is the story of completion. It is the account of how dramatic victories require sustained follow-through. It is the testimony of warriors who faced intimidating enemies without prophetic anointing or massive audiences. It is the proof that God's purposes advance through accumulated faithfulness, not just isolated moments of glory. And it is the reminder that the most important work is often the least celebrated, but no less essential for achieving lasting change.